Okay, and I see we have a couple questions in here already. Type questions into the Q&A, and I have some questions left over from last week too, so I'll maybe alternate here. So first question in the Q&A. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. When is your new book coming out?
Great question. Yeah, hopefully later this spring. My initial draft is done. It's being read by a few close circle of people right now, and then hopefully I can get it to Scott for the editing piece in the next couple of weeks, and then we'll move forward from there. So it's taking shape. I'm very excited about it. So hopefully by late spring we'll have something.
I should think so. Yeah.
Thanks for asking.
Okay, I'm going to go to one of last week's question. How do you rebuild a relationship step by step after betrayal, trauma, and sex addiction? There's a big question. How much time do we have?
Right.
6 more minutes. We may need it.
Well, first of all, I just want to honor the question, because the idea of rebuilding relationship is such a critical piece. And I think a lot of people, both partners and addicts, sort of question whether that's something they even want to go toward, and how to do it and all that. So good for you for asking the question. And I think there's a lot of material out there on this process. We basically know it's a long process. So I think the first essential feature is patience to have. I know Stephanie Carnes, among other people, talks about a 5-year window basically for this recovery process, requires both individual work on the part of the addict and the partner, and then some healing and some couples work and more healing. And it's a long process, disclosure and restitution and all that. So it can be a long process. I think the emotional work is what can take time, and that can be what's variable. But I think really, to put it in kind of 30,000 foot view, from my point of view, the addict and the partner really have to do their individual work initially, right? There's the partner definitely has their own recovery work to do. The addict has usually lifelong patterns and beliefs, and often a history of trauma and other kinds of issues that have affected the addiction, let alone the addiction takes on a life of its own. So that takes a while to work on. The partner also often has betrayal trauma. There's sometimes actual PTSD, there's trauma issues, there's support systems, there's basically getting the partner's recovery system in place and recovery network in place. So I think, at least initially, for a matter of months, both parties are on an individual recovery track. And then I think you start to look at opportunities for couples therapy or conjoint therapy where the relationship is healed. That often takes place after the disclosure, the formal disclosure, where, and many partners, and rightly so, are reluctant to move forward until like all the cards are on the table, right? And that happens typically in the disclosure. So they feel ill-equipped to make an informed decision about what they want to do until they know the whole story. And I totally understand that. So that itself takes some time. But then if the couple decides that this is something we want to work on, then I think couples therapy can benefit with ongoing individual therapy. So it's a long process. And I think the trajectory is not just of solving and healing old wounds, but really rebuilding something new and fresh. And I think learning how to connect with each other, we almost by definition, we think of sex addicts and porn addicts as having an intimacy dysfunction disorder, where there's probably lifelong patterns of not learning how to really be vulnerable in a relationship, how to trust, how to communicate, how to share feelings, how to identify feelings. Also, so there's some kind of basic remedial emotional work that sometimes has to take place. So depending on where the people are starting, it can take a while. But I think basically, as I said, it's individual first, and then sort of bridging that gap in through a disclosure and couples therapy, and then starting to really rebuild. And I think couples have to, we've mentioned bits and pieces of this in this webinar before, but couples really have to look at recreating something new, right? And having some fun along the way, and creating something that's not just full of tension and deceit and gaslighting and dishonesty, and just kind of building those new honest frameworks where everybody has a voice and people really share. I think that's the key. And and so many of us have different issues. So I think it's hard to put a timetable on it, but I think we're talking at least the couples I know that have really come around where they have a really full and loving and satisfying and healthy relationship. We're talking years, right? And it's not a lifetime's worth of work, but it takes a while to heal. And a lot of this is changing lifelong patterns. And so that's why it takes so long. And not all of that is drudgery. I think a lot of couples start to have fun and enjoy each other, well before they're done healing. So I think it's not all grim and anger. This can be a lot of fun, but it's a gradually unfolding of this process. And trust takes time. The addicts always want that trust to be reinstituted quickly, and partners with every bit of understanding are reluctant to do so fast. So there's different timetables in the works here too. So just kind of unfolds gradually. I think the thing to do, if you're really committed to the relationship, you're both committed to the relationship, is really to persist and to get help you need and be patient, and it will happen if the will is there.
Yeah. Now, you're not going to get your old relationship back. There's always going to be before the infidelity and after the infidelity. But let me also say, are you sure you want the old relationship back? Wouldn't you rather have something better? And the recovery process actually works toward building, in almost all cases, a better relationship than the couple had before, because in particular, the addict starts to become rigorously honest, hopefully. And by the way, if you don't get rigorously honest, you're not going to heal the relationship. And as part of that, becomes a more vulnerable and open individual, and also more open to receiving the betrayed partner's vulnerability. The intimacy can be better than ever because the addiction is taken out of the way. The addictions take us away from intimacy. They're the opposite of intimacy. Instead of reaching out to you, I turn to a substance or a behavior. There's nothing intimate about that. So yeah, but I like what David said, persist, and be aware that it's going to be 2 steps forward and, 1 3/4 steps back, and 2 steps forward and a half a step back, and, 2 steps forward and a step back. It's just going to, but eventually, particularly if both partners are working on their recovery, but especially the addict, and the addict is getting rigorously honest and staying sober and telling the truth. Relationship healing really does happen. We named our website Sex and Relationship Healing for a reason, because it does happen. Okay, next one. I'm a male addict who is brand new to the 12 steps. I attended my first meeting last Friday, and it was much different than I thought it would be. Are there groups or instructional groups that, I'm going to back up for a second. In terms of healing relationships, for addicts, we have an Out of the Doghouse work group that starts at the beginning of February. It's up and running. And for betrayed partners, we're going to have a 6-week online work group that helps betrayed partners work through these issues. And that'll probably be up and running in April. Okay, sorry. Got that plug out of the way. I meant to mention that because it is actually kind of important. Okay, next question. I'm a male addict, brand new to the 12 steps. Attended my first meeting last Friday, and it was much different than I thought it would be. Are there groups or instructional groups that go through the steps and working the steps step by step? Is this even the right track of thinking? Any advice for a person new to 12-step SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous, would be appreciated. What a great question. David?
Wow. Congratulations, first of all, for you for discovering recovery and 12-step program. And these are great questions. And so sometime I'd be curious to what was different than you thought it would be. But I think what that tells me, though, is that you're open to what it was. And I think sometimes people have a very inaccurate view of what the meetings might be like, and they're not open to the actual experience of it. They have a lot of judgment and preconceptions about what it is. So glad to know that you went and are there. And yes, I mean, there are a number of different kinds of meetings within each fellowship. And so there's sometimes beginners meetings, there's sometimes regular meetings, there's often step meetings where the focus will be on the step, where oftentimes they'll read the step from program literature and then discuss it. And very often they'll take, well, it depends. I've been on meetings where it's a step a week. Sometimes they do, they tie them to the month of the year. And so they go through a whole step cycle during the course of a year. But there's many different kinds of formats that are specialty like that. And so I think you'll probably find something that works well for you. It's really important too to reach out and connect. And I think to find a sponsor, and maybe a temporary sponsor would be the way to go right now. I always tell my clients a temporary sponsor is better than the perfect sponsor, because sometimes you can spend way too long looking for just the right fit. And a sponsor that was really essential to have someone you can call, and then you can also reach out to other people that can serve as your accountability partners, and just connection, because we know that the key to recovery is connection. And so stay, one of the things we often talk about here is to stay for the meeting after the meeting. And even on Zooms, they'll often hold the meeting open, because that's the fellowship that's so important. And I made this mistake when I was early in recovery. I would, as soon as the closing prayer was done, I was out the door. And I missed a huge amount until I realized that the fellowship that happened after that was where the real human connections occur. And it may be coffee, maybe a lot of meetings go out to dinner, or just to socialize in the parking lot after the meeting. But I think that connection, those creating connections, are really important. But I think the key is to stick it out. It was recommended to me that when I was new, do 90 and 90 and just give it a chance. And I was really glad I did, because there were several moments after a couple of weeks and 1 or 2 months where I'd like, oh, this may not be for me. But I stuck it out because that was my commitment. And I was so glad I did, because some misconceptions I had were cleared up. And also I felt much more connected. I started to really look forward to the meetings, and look forward, more important for me, coming out of real isolation, was to look forward to the connection that I had discovered in those meetings, the other people. And so, yeah, give it a chance, keep coming back. And yeah, if in whatever fellowship you're attending, if you look through the meeting guide, I'm sure you'll find different kinds of specialty meetings that will work for you.
Yeah, I always feel like there are 3 parts to any 12-step program, and David hit on all 3 of them. Number 1 is the meetings themselves. Number 2 is actually working the steps, which I think is best done with the sponsor who has worked the steps. And the 3rd part is the fellowship. And I can tell you that's the part that kept me sober early, and it's the part that still keeps me sober today. Working through the 12 steps, I learned a lot. I learned as much doing the 12 steps as I did in therapy and in treatment. Different stuff. And that's actually kind of a little follow-up question for you, David. What else should this individual be thinking about in addition to 12 steps? I'm glad you're here. This is definitely a great adjunct, but what else is on the docket?
Yeah, so I think a lot of people have the idea that going to a 12-step meeting is basically the same as therapy and the same as all the kind of self-work they have to do. And it's really important to identify the distinctions. 12-step meetings are an essential part of learning the skills, getting the fellowship, having those accountability people, the regular connection that kind of keeps the mechanics of your recovery going forward. For the deeper work, for the more personal issues, for issues of, I don't know, shame or trauma or validation or whatever it might be a little deeper, you can talk about some of that stuff in a meeting as it pertains to the meeting. But I think it's really important to be open to having some kind of work with a therapist. And we recommend a CSAT, which is Certified Sex Addiction Therapist. Sex and porn addiction are very unique, even among people that are familiar with addictions. And if you don't have somebody that really understands some of the unique aspects, therapists can actually do harm, not intentionally, but they just don't know some of the protocols, and they're not aware of, I think, some of the intricacies of sex addiction and porn addiction. So CSAT, Certified Sex Addiction Therapist, is what we recommend. So the idea of therapy is going to be really important as an adjunct. And I'm many years in recovery, and I still will go through phases. I'm not always in therapy, but I'll go to therapy for a while, then take a 4 or 5 year break or something, and then go back, right? So I think therapy is kind of a lifelong process, I think, in a healthy way, for me at least. It doesn't have to be for everybody, but I think it does need to be a component of your recovery, at least in the beginning, because I think it'll really save you tons of work. Can you get sober and stay sober in 12-step program by itself? Yeah, but I think therapy probably is going to save you years and years of trial and error in a meeting, and it'll pay off in the long run for sure.
For this next question, I'm going to go to a carryover from last week. I am in recovery 7 months with about 3 months of sobriety. My wife and I have not been sexual since she found out about my addiction, but we want to be. My problem is that when we try, I can't perform. She thinks I'm not attracted to her, but I think this might be part of my addiction still. I have tried Viagra and it doesn't help me. What else can I do?
Great question. And that's a really tough spot too, because I think so many guys want to show their wives or their partners that they're really attracted to them. And the more pressure there is to perform, the more likely it is that you're not going to be able to, just because of the stress involved. So I've heard of that a lot. So the way I try to frame this with sex and porn addiction, the driving force for that erotic desire is intensity, and very high intensity. And so through sex addiction or porn or amphetamines and sex, we hit these very high levels of dopamine release that are not achievable or not possible in the real world without those addictive behaviors. But the problem with this, over time, our brains get used to that very high level of input, and nothing else meets that level. And so it's very difficult to get aroused unless we have that level of intensity. Now, that will start to will shift back to normal, right? And you said 7 or 8 months of recovery. So by this point, you should start seeing some of that coming back. And when it's not, I recommend a couple things. One, really check your thoughts and your fantasy, because we know now from PET scans and really elaborate scanning abilities that we know how our brains look when we're looking at porn or when we're acting out sexually, but we know that they look exactly the same way when we're thinking about porn or thinking about acting out sexually. The thinking about the fantasy lights up the brain in the same way. And when you're doing that, even if it's only briefly, it can really hold back that recovery of sexual functioning, because it's keeping the brain expecting that very high level of intensity that it got through the addiction, and it's not starting to get used to normal things. So be careful, be really pure with your thoughts and where they go. The second thing is that addiction teaches us that we have to be highly stimulated with your fantasy in order to get aroused. And it's very difficult, as I mentioned, we can't achieve those levels of intensity unless we're in some kind of addictive behavior. So what I recommend is doing a workaround around the brain. And since you have a partner that's also wants what you want, there's really wonderful exercises. The one I mention here all the time is by Masters and Johnson. It's called Sensate Focus. And it's really an intimacy touch exercise. And this is the workaround I'm speaking of, that our bodies, if we can be comfortable, be vulnerable, have touch and explore without trying to drive sexuality with fantasy or intensity, but just let our bodies connect. And the Sensate Focus exercise starts out as specifically not a sexual exercise. It's strictly a way to connect with somebody. And what it is, it's a giving and taking of pleasure where your partner guides touch, right? It could be tickling or stroking or massaging or whatever touch, and you get the feedback back and forth, and you switch, and it gradually builds this connection. But it's a different way of getting aroused. It's a different way of connecting than that a very kind of fantasy-driven element of sex addiction. So try those kinds of things. The physical approach is very helpful. The other thing about Viagra, we've talked about here before too. What porn and sex addiction does, unfortunately, it affects our brain and the fantasy level required to be aroused at all. And with tolerance that happens with addiction, it goes higher and higher and higher. And so that's why we're always kind of getting to more escalation with our addictive behaviors, just to get that dopamine kick that we have a hard time getting. But my point here with the Viagra not working is that the Viagra only works once the signal has come from your brain down to your genitalia, and then the Viagra helps with certain chemicals that help you get an erection, but it requires that signal. And if you've reset your level so high that the signal doesn't generate because you're not getting that level of intensity you need, it's not, Viagra is not going to work. And so you really need to kind of just let your brain reset, if you will, and get back used to normal levels of arousal based on things that don't require all the intensity of fantasy related to porn and sex. So patience, being really pure with your thoughts, not spending a lot of time in fantasy, which you shouldn't be doing anyway, and trying other ways to explore with your partner intimacy and touch. And I would take the focus off erections and orgasms. You know, that's a lot of guys classically, you know, that's where we go, right, in our heads. And there's so much more than that. And I would just really take that off the table. Don't worry about it. Just connect, touch, explore, you know, be tender, be vulnerable, and see what happens. And very often that's when the erection comes, when you're not putting yourself under such pressure to make it happen. Just take your time with it and just reconnect with each other and rediscover each other in a kind of playful, curious way. And I think that'll get you much farther than Viagra.
Okay, back to the Q&A. Hello, Dr. Fawcett. How are each of the sex addiction 12-step groups different? SAA, SLAA, SCA, SAA, SRA. I should probably answer this one.
Yeah. Yeah, Scott, why don't you go ahead?
And I've been to all these groups except SRA. So,
yeah.
So I actually don't know that much about SexRA, or Sexual Recovery Anonymous, SRA. Sexaholics Anonymous, SA, is a program that defines sobriety for you. There is no sex with anyone other than your long-term partner. They used to be legally married heterosexual. They've loosened that up, but if you are in a long-term partnership and you want to be monogamous with your long-term partner, Sexaholics Anonymous is probably a good group for you. It's not for everyone. And like I said, they define sobriety for you. There's no masturbation. You know, it's very strict. Sexual Compulsives Anonymous and Sex Addicts Anonymous are very, very similar programs. They started on different coasts about the same time. Sexual Compulsives Anonymous is very, very gay friendly. Sex Addicts Anonymous is also gay friendly, but you know, SCA was I think started in San Francisco. It's a very gay oriented group, but everyone is welcome. SAA I think was started in New York. Don't quote me on that. And it was mostly straight to begin with, but it's very gay friendly. And their definitions of sobriety are, you know, you get to define your own sobriety. The programs are very, very similar. If you're comfortable in one meeting, you will be comfortable in another. Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, if you identify as a love addict, that's probably a good group for you. You'll see a lot more women, typically in SLAA. And then there are also some Porn Addicts Anonymous and Sex and Porn Addicts Anonymous. They all have their own little approach. They're all more similar than different in my experience. That's number one. Number two, meetings within each program can be very different, as David said, from other meetings within each program. Some meetings are speaker meetings. Some meetings are open sharing. Some meetings are step meetings, so they focus on, you know, a particular step or the 12 steps in general. And you know, there's different people in each group, so they're all going to have their own personality. I would invite you to explore them all and find out where you feel most comfortable and most at home and most supported. You know, where you identify with the people and feel most supported. And I would look for a meeting where people are talking about the solution more than they're talking about the problem. My personal preference. I like to live in the solution, not the problem. I lived in the problem for a long time and I didn't do well with that. When I was around people who were talking about the solution, I did much better. David, I don't know if you want to add any thoughts to that.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, if somebody is struggling with chemsex or drugs and sex. Just a lot of people find the SLA meetings to be the most friendly for that. Although I think it depends on the meetings and the city you're in.
The city a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the different meetings tend to have kind of different cultures in different places. So I really endorse what Scott said. Just try them and see where you're comfortable and who you relate with and where you feel you can really benefit.
Yeah, I live in Palm Springs. There's a lot of gay men here. The predominant program here is SAA, Sex Addicts Anonymous. And the chemsex guys often find more recovery in Sex Addicts Anonymous meetings than they do in CMA meetings, which is Crystal Meth Anonymous. So here, but it's going to be different everywhere.
Right.
How betrayed partner? Yeah, we talked about that one. That was a question from last week. Hello, an addict who likes novelty. How can he deal with having an engaging and satisfactory sexual relationship? It looks impossible. So this is somebody who craves novelty, which is highly addictive.
Yeah. Right. So you're right to be to notice novelty and to be concerned about it. Right. Novelty is related to dopamine, and dopamine is kind of the driving force in any addiction. And dopamine gets, to personify it, gets kind of bored easily. And so dopamine is always looking for something new and different and exciting, kind of the bright, shiny object. And so with addiction, it kind of, we thrive on novelty, and what we did last week is kind of boring and dull. We are looking something edgier and more exciting this week. And so we start to get used to this ever increasing levels of novelty that really can get us in trouble after a while, because we escalate in sometimes in areas that are, taboo or kinky or illegal sometimes. So we have to really be cautious about that need for novelty. That said, our brains do kind of start to go to sleep, if you will, unless they're engaged and interested. And so I think one of the big challenges for long-term relationships and couples, whether you're a sex addict or not, is keeping the interest alive, right? And keeping that novelty. And so I think in terms of a relationship, I think we need to really focus on, I mentioned earlier on the words kind of being curious and playful in terms of sexual play and sexuality in a relationship. I think that approach is really useful, to not let it get stale and not let it get too dry and boring and rote. I think we need to be actively engaged, and we can't really be standing still too much, especially when it comes to sexuality. So I think that said, that can be kind of hard to do sometimes, but I think to at least understand that we do need to work at it to keep it interesting in the long-term relationship, because that novelty does start to fade into more of a everyday looking like the last one. Now, in terms of meeting that need for novelty sometimes, I think we can meet it in non-addictive ways. And I think we all thrive on it. And we know there's a lot of brain research that shows that novelty kind of keeps us young or young at heart, and keeps us engaged, keeps our brains in good shape. So I think novelty in areas that aren't addictive, or not in areas that pertain to our own addiction, at least, novelty in terms of learning new stuff, trying new things. And that can be worked into our daily lives, not falling into the same rut of the same meals or the same.
Yeah, particularly if you're doing new things with your partner. If you say, oh, let's try scuba diving, you might have great sex after that.
No, exactly. And then I don't know if I mentioned it, I think I did before, with healing a couple, but it's really to do things together, try new things together. And Scott's exactly right. Like, learn a new skill, learn a new hobby, take a trip, do something fun and different. And that's also novelty. And I think the more we can do it in the terms of a connection context, the better. And it can be with our partner, it can also be with friends. I talk about a lot of the guys I treat who are chemsex addicts who love the high intensity sports, like, parachuting or rappelling or bungee jumping or whatever. But if they can do it with other people in recovery, suddenly becomes, they meet their need for novelty and intensity, but they're also doing it in a group setting. So I think I think it's important to recognize that we all have a need for novelty, but I think where we steer that need is important. And so learning new things, learning a new language, visiting a new place, doing something new and different, and building it into your life as much as possible will go a long way towards satisfying that need. And frankly, with my own addictive disorders and recovery, I kind of like the same old, because I think there's a little bit of predictability in terms of those aspects of my life. I try to create novelty in other areas, not in terms of my addiction or my recovery processes. For me, at least, I have having some regularity and a pattern for my recovery activities is very comforting to me. So I don't. And now that said, do I like to strike out and find new meetings once in a while? Sure. Or try a new meeting here, or a group of people to go to coffee with there. There's other ways we can enhance it. But I think this kind of addictive need for intensity and novelty can really get us in trouble. So I'd really look at that and see what that's really about, and get that in check. But it doesn't mean that we have to live a life that's boring and dull and half dead. None of us want that. The whole point of recovery is starting to live again. And I think that includes a lot of fun and exciting things that we haven't tried before. So
I want to take a second and talk about pornography, because every time I hear novelty and intensity, pornography is an intense drug. It's an intensity addiction. And what makes it so intense is the novelty and the abundance, and what we call intermittent reward, which I don't think you mentioned there, but maybe we can talk about a little bit. These things really, intermittent reward is highly addictive. They build it into video games. They build it into gambling machines. Porn sort of does it naturally. We never know which image is going to be the next, the one that really gets us. And that makes it even more addictive than if every image was great, but there are so many of them, and we can just click and click and click and click and click and lose hours and hours and hours. So can you talk a little bit about what happens to the brain when that goes on, and how long it takes the brain to sort of reboot or reset or get back to a baseline where we don't need this hyper intensity to enjoy life?
Right. So there's a famous neuroscientist named Robert Sapolsky who talked about if there's a maybe in the formula, it's really hard for humans to put it down. And so if we think about, Scott mentioned a slot machine, that those are written very carefully because they understand exactly how the brain works. And it's written to give us a reward intermittently, every once in a while. We never know when it's coming. And so that makes it highly irresistible for humans. And it's just the way our brains work, that the reward, the little dopamine kick that comes with it, we never know it's coming. It might just be the next one. It might just be the next one after that. And suddenly we're losing a lot of money. And they'll throw you a win once in a while, but never enough to kind of really, really win. The house always wins in that. The same thing goes with Facebook algorithms and Instagram, and they're all geared toward, and video games. They're all geared toward rewards and points and likes and shares and next levels. And it's this competitive thing, and we never quite know when it's going to happen. And it just keeps engaged all the time. Facebook and Instagram do it so they can sell and do things. In terms of the addiction, we do it to keep our addiction alive. So this formula is really disastrous for an addict, because it sucks us right in and it escalates and it keeps us locked in that pattern. So once we can break free of that in recovery, it takes a while before our brains can start to adapt again. And I think there's a process, and I'm always looking for the right metaphor. We've talked about rebooting and all the re words, right? Which don't really ever, none of them are a good, really, a comparison. What we know is that the brain needs to kind of cool off. It's in an overheated situation. And the only way it can cool off is to have some kind of period away from all this addictive behavior. And that's why we talk about some kind of period of abstinence. And there's no magic number in the literature. Some programs anecdotally do 90 days or even a year sometimes. It varies depending on your age, and just there's so many factors it's hard to predict. But we know that some kind of break away from the intensity, away from the sex itself will help you kind of break the lock on that. And then gradually starting to sort of re-engage with things. And there are certain things, that's why we talk about circles, that inner circle behavior. If porn is an issue for you, it's probably not ever going to be safe for you to re-engage with porn, right? With sex addiction recovery, we want to pull healthy sex back into our lives, but not the addictive part of it. So we have to look very carefully, what aspects of sex were problematic for me? Which ones do I want to work on? Do I need to work on to kind of reestablish a relationship that doesn't involve that drive to get to the next thing? So it takes time, it takes patience, and it takes learning, really learning where to get dopamine from other places. And that's where the outer circle behaviors come in. What are healthy things where we can get dopamine, whether it's listening to good music or good food or playing with our dogs or having fun with our partner or enjoying a sport. There's all kinds of ways to get dopamine, and we need to find healthier ways, because what happens with that reward system is that all those other things fall by the wayside because none of them can match the intensity and the kick of the addictive process. So,
and we've talked about this before, David. We learn in recovery that it's not all about dopamine. I mean, the intensity just drives dopamine, the intensity of the addiction. But when we start feeling more connected, we get serotonin and oxytocin and some other pleasure-inducing neurochemicals. They're not quite as intense, but they can ultimately be a lot more rewarding. To have a dopamine hit while I'm feeling connected and getting serotonin and oxytocin, it's a different feeling. But most people that I talk to who get there say it's much better. I don't know why I was chasing that intensity. This is better.
Totally. And I'd really encourage people to talk to some people that have been around in recovery for a while, for whom that's happened, and to hear the first person accounts, because I think when you're new in program, it's really hard to imagine that anything could. I've had clients tell me, so my life is going to be, dull, boring, vanilla, or no
sex.
sex.
Watch Grey's Anatomy reruns for the rest of my life. Great.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not the way it is, but I can tell you that as a therapist, but I think it's much more powerful hearing it from somebody who's lived it. And So we need to, our brains have been hijacked basically by the addiction, and we need to kind of wean them off that and then teach them other ways, healthier ways, and much more actually fulfilling ways of getting that satisfaction with a much more balanced plate of different neurochemicals, not just the dopamine.
I'm going to reword this next one a little bit. This is a person who has heard that when addicts first start engaging in addictive behaviors, their emotional age freezes. Why and how does this happen?
Right, and I think that's true. When we pick up our mood-altering substance, and then, for, like I started drinking when I was, I don't know, 15 or something, like everybody else, but I drank addictively from the beginning. But a part of me kind of froze at that moment, because what the addiction does, whether it's a substance or a behavior, it kind of takes the emotional processing piece and just kind of hijacks it. It shuts it down. It numbs. It disconnects us from it. It kind of interrupts that growth process, and we get distracted and hijacked into the addiction. And so in many ways, those parts of ourselves are kind of frozen in place. And when we get into recovery, and I had this conscious feeling, I kind of felt 15 in many ways, because I was emotionally pretty much that age, because that's where I got derailed, if you will. And so our ages do freeze, along with the emotional intelligence and erotic intelligence and sort of the growth, the emotional growth that happens normally if it doesn't get interrupted. But I think addiction is very effective at just sort of stopping that progression. And so very often we can, be 50 years old but still be kind of an adolescent emotionally. And so I think that's where some of the therapy I mentioned before is very useful in recovery, because that's generally recognized, I think, in 12-step recovery programs, but people don't really know what to do with that so much. So I think that's where therapy can really be beneficial. But I think that's generally true, that people kind of stop progressing forward once the addiction kind of pulls them out of that growth path and hijacks them into the addictive corner, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I got sober in my mid-30s. I started engaging in my addictions in middle school, and that's kind of where my emotional growth stopped in a lot of respects. I mean, suddenly I was in my mid-30s and I didn't know how to be romantic with somebody. I didn't know how to ask somebody on a date or tell them that I was interested, or I didn't know how to do any of that because I'd never really done any of it. I just kind of skipped over it and went straight to sex. And
Right.
and the same with drinking. And I didn't know how to process emotions in a healthy way.
I was going to say, it's much more than just sexual behavior. It's
Yeah, oh yeah.
figure out, what do I need? What do I want? What am I feeling? All that stuff gets kind of muted.
Yeah, I mean, I had two emotions, angry and high. I was in my addiction or I was pissed off. I mean, that was it. That was So yeah, it took a long time to grow up, basically.
Yeah.
But it was fun growing up. As an adult and being aware that I'm growing up, kids aren't aware that they're growing up. In my mid-30s, I was like, oh, I did that better today than yesterday. Cool.
Right,
it's kind of
exactly.
neat. So,
And it's much faster, I think, in recovery too. Once we know
yeah, probably,
how it
but
works.
yeah. So, is it necessary for sex addicts to share their recovery work with a betrayed partner? Or is it a need to know basis? Don't ask, don't tell. Good question.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing. I think there's a lot of recovery work that is private, and I think we've had guys at Seeking Integrity who will, we do a lot of writing assignments and a lot of work and insight, and a lot of them have journals and notebooks, and to their dismay, sometimes they'll find that their partner invited themselves to go through their journals and it's just that's a real violation in my opinion. Now, there are certain things need to be shared. I think sometimes it's very healthy to have phone access or whatever, if that's the agreement with the couple. That's legitimate, right, to for accountability. But I think it's the recovering addict does have a right to certain elements of privacy in terms of the deeper internal work they're doing. Now, I do think it's healthy for the addict to share that with the partner. In many cases, share their insights, and I recommend daily check-ins where people can talk about that stuff and say what's going on and share their findings. But I think to some extent, it's up to the addict with some of these deeper elements, and this can relate to old trauma or old kinds of emotional wounds or experiences or whatever. I think that belongs to the addict and is up to the addict to share if and when they feel it's appropriate to do so. That's that kind of internal therapeutic work. I think otherwise it just makes it unsafe for the person to do that work, and the work may stop. So I think boundaries, it comes down to boundaries, are healthy for everybody. It doesn't mean that secrets are healthy, but boundaries are healthy, I think. And I do think just some addicts choose to have their life be an open book. That's fine. I think, though, if somebody doesn't feel comfortable with that at this point in early recovery, especially, it's okay for them to have certain elements of privacy of the stuff they talk about with their therapist and their sponsor. And when the time is right, they can share it with their spouse. But I think there's no duty or obligation to share that growth work in real time.
There are certain things that I think sex addicts should always share with the partner. A circle plan, your sobriety plan, your fidelity plan. Here are my bottom line behaviors. Here are my slippery behaviors. Here are my healthy behaviors. Your partner not only should see that, your partner should have input. You left this off your bottom line behaviors. Why don't you, and this out of your middle, so that should be shared. I'm going to this 12-step meeting, this 12-step meeting, and this support group online, and I'm taking this work group. That should be shared. Your partner should know what, in a general way, what you're doing for your recovery. But, and of course, you're going to share your disclosure, formal therapeutic disclosure in therapy setting with your therapist and your partner's therapist. your prep work for disclosure is yours. Your partner should not be getting in your prep work for disclosure because that could be highly triggering. Disclosures are presented in a specific way, so they're less triggering and the information gets out and it's more healing, and etc. So yeah, the answer to your question is yes and no. Some of it you need to share, but like as David said, that inner work is yours. So I agree. Okay, my sex addict husband was not a drinker, smoker, or drug user until his affair. While he visited or stayed with the affair partner, he engaged in substance abuse. The last time he went back to his parents to attempt recovery work, he had to quit vaping. He has since gone back to the affair partner. He said he continues to attend support groups from SRH, that's us, and is trying to work with a sponsor. I have no proof, and I'm working to remove myself from the affair triangulation. The part of me that is still concerned for him wants to ask about the likelihood of him fully healing when he stays in an unstable environment. So an unstable environment and potentially some substance abuse still happening.
Right. So first, the substance abuse, I think there's a thing I call whack-a-mole syndrome, which is where we can get in recovery from a behavior or a drug. And unless we are very careful and deal with some of the underlying issues, it's really easy to transfer that addictive behavior or that addictive impulse to something else. And it can jump from porn to alcohol or from alcohol to gambling. I mean, it can bounce around in ways that are very easy to see. So I think being really careful about not just transferring addictive behaviors is critical for somebody in recovery, because that's a very common phenomenon. I'm not sure the significance of him starting those things with his affair partner, except it is a kind of addictive, intense experience, right?
But I've actually heard numerous people who become somebody completely different with the affair partner. And I think that's part of the appeal. Sometimes when
like
people
a different life.
seek out, and yeah, they're seeking a whole different life. And it's not that they don't love the life they have. It really is not that they don't love the life they have. It's that they've got some unresolved something, and they need to pursue it or choose to pursue it.
Right, right. And then we just need as stable an environment as possible for a foundation for recovery. And I think that, in my mind, that means quitting everything addictive, because it's so easy to substitute, as I said, and just really finding that stability. I'm trying to get the links between going here and going there and quitting this and picking up that. But I think the bottom line is that it's very easy to transfer stuff. And so we need to really be pristine about that and stop the addictive outlets, including cigarettes. You mentioned vaping. Cigarettes and nicotine are equally destructive than some of the drugs that have reputations as hardcore drugs. But I think also just to be to get as much stability around us and recovery people as we can. And I think I'm sorry to hear that he went back to his affair partner, but I think this is again where the commitment of full recovery without kind of piecemeal is going to be really important.
Yeah, and you know, we offer we call them individual support sessions online, and basically they're just kind of you call up and we talk for an hour, and somebody will tell their story. And if somebody told me this story, and then you know Tammy or I or whoever is taking the call makes some recommendations. I mean, this is, and I think David will probably agree to this kind of situation where somebody's still kind of in it, and they're in it, they're out, they're in, they're out. This individual probably needs inpatient treatment.
Yeah.
Probably needs to come to residential and get completely removed from everything, and break through the denial. And I mean, a lot of what we do at our treatment center, where we do not let people drink, use, or smoke, or vape,
or contact their affair partners,
is we separate them from, you know, the environment that they've been acting out in, and we work on their denial, and sometimes it can take the better part of a couple of weeks just to
Oh yeah.
bang through some really heavy denial, and then you can start doing actual work. And even then denial will crop up, and it can be a real roller coaster with this. It's a problem, it's not a problem, it's a problem, but I can't live with that. That whole craziness.
Yeah, and Scott's absolutely right. I think when I see a case like this where there's different attempts made and they're kind of not working, and other things are popping up and other things are given up and come back, and that's, I think, a great case to get away and come to a place that's a kind of a safe environment for a couple of weeks would be really a good foundation. For sure.
Okay, the next one here. Hello, I am a betrayed partner just starting my recovery process. I'm walking on eggshells at home. I'm worried that any joke or benign comment can unknowingly trigger my husband. Any advice? Is it possible to trigger my husband, or is that outside of me and my actions? Obviously, I'm new to this journey. Thank you. This is a great question.
First of all, congratulations on starting this exciting journey. I think the key factor to remember here, at least in my point of view, is that the addict is responsible for the addict's behavior, right? And nobody can make the addict do anything. Now, can the addict get triggered? And we don't want to throw stuff in people's faces and kind of and say something that's unkind or potentially triggering on purpose. But I think basically you have a right to sort of express your feelings and be straightforward and communicate with integrity on your own part, without worry that if you share your feelings in a healthy way, that what you say might trigger a reaction. Ultimately, the addict is responsible for what they do, and for letting themselves get triggered or not. And it's the responsibility of the addict to have the tools to manage those situations. And those would be people, a sponsor, people, recovery connections, accountability partners, and so on. And so I think it's important for you to, approach this in good faith, obviously, and not be hurtful, but I think it's also important for you not to have to walk around on eggshells and for fear of saying the wrong thing, because basically the addict has to learn how to deal with real feelings and manage it without being so fragile that anything you might say might trigger him. So I think in many ways, I'd encourage you to get the support you need for yourself. By the way, there are a lot of partner groups here on sex relationship healing that where this would be a great question for the partners that are on those groups, because there's a lot of experience and wisdom there, and they could share with real life examples of how they have addressed this particular issue. But I guess the bottom line from my point of view is to you have a right to feel what you're feeling and saying what you're saying, if it's not done in a very hurtful way. But I think without worrying that you're going to send the addict off in a tailspin from something you say. That's going to be his responsibility to manage.
Yeah, I'm reminded of when I got sober from alcohol, and I have a lot of normie friends, they're not addicts, they're not alcoholics, they just don't have these problems, God forbid. And we would go out to dinner and, they'd forget that I was in recovery. This is when I was newly in recovery, and they'd order a drink and then they'd go, oh. I'd be like, get a drink. I'm not drinking. Doesn't mean you can't drink. They were sort of walking on eggshells, and they finally realized, oh, Scott's not going to lose his sobriety if I have a glass of wine with dinner. My mother was very overly protective, almost annoyingly so. My sister had one of her weddings. There have been several. When I was newly sober, and my mother made sort of a blanket statement now this is non-alcoholic champagne. This is for Scott because he's not drinking anymore. And she's pouring me, pumping this stuff into me. And I was like, oh my God, woman, leave me alone. I mean, I totally got that she was trying to support me, but it was you know what? I have to stay sober. It's on me to stay sober. So yeah, I mean, I I really empathize with your feelings, but I totally agree with David. Your husband's recovery is, I'm assuming it's a husband, is his recovery, not yours. You can't get well for him. You can try to create a safe environment. If I was recovering from meth addiction and my roommate was using meth, we would probably have to have a conversation like, I really can't have meth in the house. It's going to have to go. Frankly, I would get a new roommate. But, if I was serious about my recovery, but, it's my job to protect me. I wouldn't make my meth using roommate quit meth. I'd say, I'm quitting. I'm going to meetings. I can't be around it. So I'm going to move. But it's not his problem. I do not have a roommate or a meth using roommate, just for the record. And never have. So, but whatever.
Where there's been an active addiction in a relationship, there's going to be some tough conversations, right? There's a lot of pain and anger and hurt and disappointment, and all those things you're going to have to talk about to heal the relationship. And those are all potentially triggering, but that's why we do it often with the help of a therapist or in a context or over time. But just we can't avoid those conversations. Those have to be talked about. And and it's the addict has to learn how to have those conversations and not act out.
Thank you, everybody. We're out of time. Thank you, David. I know you just got off a plane minutes ago, practically. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for great questions. It was really good questions this week. Thank you. And we'll be back next week, same time, same place. Except David will not be here next week. You'll have Tammy with me.
That's right. Cool.
All right.
Right. Thanks, Scott. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.